Blood pooled beneath the floorboards of the Hollingsworth cabin on October 13, 1879, while outside, autumn wind carried screams that would echo through Appalachian folklore for generations. This is the story of how one family name became synonymous with terror across 3 states, and why even today locals refuse to speak it after dark. The sound of splitting wood echoes off granite cliffs. The scent of wood smoke mingles with something metallic and wrong. And beneath calloused fingertips, bark feels slick with morning dew that isn't dew at all. Nestled in the remote hollows of eastern Kentucky, where coal seams run deep and federal maps still show blank spaces, the Hollingsworth homestead squatted like a wound in the mountainside. Lenora Hollingsworth moved through her kitchen with practiced precision that October morning, her apron already stained dark before breakfast, humming a tune her grandmother taught her about keeping secrets buried. The Hollingsworth clan had settled Deadman's Hollow in 1851, when Josiah Stanhope's surveying expedition marked it as uninhabitable terrain, unsuitable for settlement. But Phineas Hollingsworth saw opportunity where others saw isolation. The hollow offered something precious: absolute privacy. No roads led in or out. No neighbors lived within 20 miles. Most importantly, no law enforcement had jurisdiction over land that didn't officially exist on any government survey. By 1879, 3 generations of Hollingsworths had carved out an existence in that forgotten valley. Visitors were rare. Those who arrived were rarer still when they left. Granville Sutherland, a traveling preacher from Virginia, had written his final letter home on October 11, 1879. The mountain folk here practice hospitalities unknown in civilized regions. I shall extend my ministry another week among these forgotten souls. His congregation never heard from him again. The preacher's disappearance might have passed unnoticed, like so many others who ventured into Kentucky's unmapped territories. But Sutherland carried something the Hollingsworths hadn't expected: a detailed journal documenting every stop on his circuit, every family he'd visited, every meal he'd shared. When his church sent Irving Dean to investigate 2 months later, Dean followed that journal like breadcrumbs through the wilderness. Some paths lead home. Dean reached Deadman's Hollow on December 5, 1879, just as the first snows trapped the valley in crystalline silence. What he discovered in the Hollingsworth compound would reshape how America understood the isolation of its own backwoods. The family had developed customs that predated law, customs that treated strangers not as guests, but as provisions for a long, cold winter. Dean's official report, filed with the Kentucky State Police in January 1880, contained 14 pages of testimony that investigators initially dismissed as frontier hysteria. Then they found the evidence. Then they found more evidence than any civilized mind could process. The Hollingsworth name became a whispered warning across 3 states. Lock your doors, avoid strange paths, and never, ever accept hospitality from folks whose eyes hold too much kindness. But understanding how a family name transforms into nightmare requires going back further to the original sin that poisoned Deadman's Hollow. It requires understanding what happens when isolation breeds not independence, but hunger, and what manner of hunger grows so deep it reshapes the very concept of family. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to uncover gets much darker. What force could drive an entire bloodline to abandon humanity itself? The answer lies buried in the Hollow's founding, where Phineas Hollingsworth first learned the taste of desperation. Phineas Hollingsworth's axe bit deep into frozen earth on March 15, 1851, each strike revealing soil so black it seemed to swallow light. The founding of Deadman's Hollow began not with hope, but with a man fleeing something worse than wilderness, his own reputation in civilized society. Understanding how the Hollingsworth name became America's most whispered curse requires witnessing the moment when survival transformed into something unrecognizable. The crunch of snow beneath worn boots mingles with the distant howl of wind through limestone caves, while the acrid smell of coal smoke burns the nostrils, and rough-hewn timber feels splinter-sharp against palms already bleeding from endless labor. Phineas had arrived in Kentucky's uncharted territories with his pregnant wife Philomena Wright and their 2 young sons, carrying little more than carpenter's tools and a warrant from Virginia authorities that made turning back impossible. The warrant, dated February 8, 1851, charged Phineas with acts of cannibalism during the severe winter of 1849-50, when provisions failed and neighbors disappeared. He'd escaped custody during transport to Richmond, but the accusations followed him like smoke. In Virginia's remote mountain communities, whispers traveled faster than law enforcement. Philomena Wright had married Phineas, knowing his reputation. Her own family had cast her out for defending him, insisting that desperate times called for desperate measures. She carried their 3rd child while helping clear land that seemed determined to resist human habitation. The hollow felt wrong from the beginning. Too quiet, too isolated, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Their first winter nearly killed them all. By December 1851, game had vanished from the surrounding ridges. The root cellar held nothing but frozen turnips and moldy cornmeal. Philomena's milk dried up, leaving their newborn daughter weak and crying. Snow blocked every route to the nearest settlement, even if Phineas had dared risk recognition by seeking help. From Philomena Wright's diary, December 23, 1851. The baby grows thinner each day. Phineas speaks of hunting, but his eyes hold that same darkness I saw in Virginia. Lord preserve us. I fear what he considers prey. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small compromises, tiny erosions of what they'd once considered unthinkable. When their oldest son collapsed from hunger, Phineas made a choice that would echo through 3 generations of Hollingsworths. He didn't hunt animals that December. He hunted the only large game left in the valley. A traveling merchant named Lucius Carrington had taken shelter in their barn during a blizzard on December 20th. He carried enough provisions to feed a family through winter: salt, pork, dried beans, flour, and most importantly, no one expected him anywhere until spring thaw. Carrington's wagon bore the markings of a Kentucky trading company, but closer inspection revealed forged documents and stolen goods. Some choices marked souls permanently. Phineas justified his actions as protecting his family from a criminal. Philomena convinced herself they were preventing theft. Their children learned that survival trumped law, that outsiders existed to serve their needs, and that family loyalty meant never questioning what happened to guests who overstayed their welcome. The merchant's disappearance established patterns that would define the Hollingsworth legacy. They kept his wagon, his goods, and his identity papers. More importantly, they discovered how easy it was to make someone vanish without trace in a valley that didn't officially exist. Carrington's trading partners assumed he'd been killed by bandits or wild animals hazards that claimed dozens of merchants annually in Kentucky's lawless territories. By spring 1852, the Hollingsworth family had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd tasted the convenience of solving problems through elimination rather than effort. When Susan Spencer, a widow seeking passage to Tennessee, asked for shelter during the April floods, the family barely debated their response. The Hollow's isolation meant they could practice hospitality on their own terms. Guests arrived grateful for shelter and left only in pieces, their belongings distributed among family members like inherited treasures. Each disappearance strengthened their conviction that outsiders existed to serve those clever enough to exploit them. Phineas taught his sons that laws belong to towns, not mountains. He showed them which bones burned completely, which clothing could be repurposed, and how to read a stranger's worth by the weight of their traveling pack. Most crucially, he demonstrated that conscience was luxury that starving families couldn't afford. The hollow shaped its inhabitants as much as they shaped it. 3 decades of isolation bred customs that would shock civilized society, customs that treated human beings as resources to be harvested when needed. By 1879, when Irving Dean arrived to investigate Granville Sutherland's disappearance, the Hollingsworth compound housed 4 generations who'd never known law, never questioned family traditions, and never considered that their methods might horrify the outside world. What happens when children raised on such lessons grow up to have children of their own? The answer lies in understanding how the second generation of Hollingsworths refined their parents' desperate improvisation into something resembling organized industry. The screens from the root cellar stopped abruptly at 11:47 p.m. on July 2, 1868, replaced by the methodical sound of Maud Hollingsworth sharpening her father's skinning knife. The first generation had killed from desperation. The second generation killed from efficiency. When children grow up believing that human beings are livestock with inconvenient voices, civilization becomes an abstract concept with no practical application. The metallic scrape of whetstone against steel mingles with crickets chirping in summer darkness, while the musty smell of root vegetables masks something far more sinister, and wooden handles feel worn smooth by hands that have learned their purpose too well. Maud Vanderbilt, née Hollingsworth, had inherited more than her father's eyes. She'd inherited his appetite for solving problems through elimination, refined by 2 decades of practice. Phineas Hollingsworth died in 1865, passing leadership of the clan to his eldest son, Irving Sinclair Hollingsworth. By then, the family had evolved from desperate survivors into something resembling a small business. They developed systems, schedules, and most disturbingly, quality standards for their work. Irving possessed his father's cunning, but lacked his father's restraint. Where Phineas had killed reluctantly, Irving killed enthusiastically. He'd grown up watching strangers disappear, learning that outsiders existed solely to serve family needs. By age 30, he'd never questioned whether their methods might be wrong. He only questioned whether they were efficient enough. The Hollow's isolation had created a laboratory for moral experimentation. 3 decades without outside interference had allowed the Hollingsworths to develop customs that would shock civilized society. They'd learned which types of travelers carried the most valuable goods, which routes provided the steadiest supply of victims, and most importantly, how to dispose of evidence in a valley where no one looked for missing persons. Florence Sinclair, Irving's wife and first cousin, had joined the family operation with disturbing enthusiasm. She'd been raised in a neighboring hollow where starvation had claimed half her siblings, making the Hollingsworth methods seem like providence rather than predation. Together, Irving and Florence transformed their parents' desperate improvisation into organized methodology. From Irving Dean's investigation notes, January 15, 1880. The compound contains multiple structures designed specifically for processing human remains. These are not crude tools of desperation, but sophisticated equipment suggesting years of refinement and practice. The second generation had advantages their parents never possessed. They'd grown up knowing exactly how to read strangers, how to identify valuable targets, and how to exploit the trust that isolated travelers placed in mountain hospitality. Most crucially, they'd never developed the psychological barriers that might have limited their actions. Families shape children through ritual. Maud remembered her first kill at age 14, a traveling preacher who'd made the mistake of criticizing their family's absence from Sunday services. Her father had guided her hands, teaching her the proper angle for the blade, the importance of controlling bleeding, and the satisfaction of watching judgment leave someone's eyes. The lesson had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with power. By 1868, the Hollingsworth compound had evolved into something resembling a rural resort, if resorts specialized in ensuring their guests never left. They'd built comfortable cabins for visitors, expanded their kitchen facilities, and even installed what appeared to be guest quarters. Travelers spoke positively about Hollingsworth hospitality in nearby towns, praising their generosity and recommending the family to other wanderers. The recommendations were genuine. Guests enjoyed excellent treatment during their stays. Comfortable beds, hearty meals, engaging conversation, and the kind of mountain hospitality that made city dwellers nostalgic for simpler times. The Hollingsworths had learned that satisfied customers generated positive word of mouth, attracting more visitors to their remote valley. What guests didn't realize was that their recommendations came with expiration dates. Maud had developed particular expertise in managing female visitors. She understood how to make women feel safe, how to gain their confidence, and how to learn their travel plans without arousing suspicion. Her cabin contained a guest register filled with names, dates, and detailed notes about each visitor's background, destination, and most importantly, who might notice their disappearance. Irving focused on male travelers, especially those carrying trade goods or substantial money. He'd learned to identify merchants, cattle buyers, land speculators, and other professionals whose disappearances might be attributed to business risks rather than foul play. His workshop contained tools that suggested carpentry to casual observers, but served far more sinister purposes for those who understood their true function. The family had also solved their disposal problems through careful study of local geography. The hollow contained several natural limestone caves that connected to underground river systems. Bodies introduced at the proper locations would travel miles underground before emerging in waterways that flowed into 3 different states. Evidence scattered across multiple jurisdictions became impossible for any single law enforcement agency to connect. Their methods had grown so sophisticated that by 1879, local communities actually competed to direct travelers toward Hollingsworth hospitality. The family's reputation for generosity and their remote location made them seem like providential shelter for people caught in mountain weather or facing difficult terrain. Even law enforcement officers recommended the compound to travelers seeking safe passage through Kentucky's lawless territories. The irony was perfect. Authorities were unknowingly feeding victims to the very predators they should have been hunting. But what happens when a system designed for perfect isolation encounters someone who understands exactly what they're seeing? Irving Dean's arrival would test every lesson the Hollingsworths had learned about manipulating visitors and reveal whether 3 decades of practice had prepared them for an investigator who already suspected the truth. Irving Dean stepped into the Hollingsworth parlor at 3:27 p.m. on December 5, 1879, his practiced eye cataloging details that would have escaped a casual visitor, the fresh sawdust scattered across floorboards, the faint metallic tang beneath wood smoke, and most telling of all, the way every family member's smile never quite reached their eyes. Dean wasn't just any traveler. He was a former Pinkerton detective whose specialty was finding people who didn't want to be found. The Hollingsworths had spent 3 decades perfecting their system, but they'd never encountered someone who understood predatory behavior from a professional perspective. The gentle creak of settling timber masks the sound of sharpening steel from somewhere deeper in the compound, while the smell of fresh bread cannot quite overwhelm the underlying scent of lye and iron, and the carved wooden armrest feels suspiciously smooth, as if recently scrubbed clean of stains that wouldn't wash away easily. Dean had arrived under the pretense of searching for his missing colleague, Granville Sutherland, but his true mission was far more comprehensive. He suspected the Hollingsworth compound was connected to a pattern of disappearances spanning 3 states. Irving Sinclair Hollingsworth greeted Dean with the same practiced warmth he'd shown hundreds of previous guests. He offered shelter from the approaching snowstorm, hot food, and comfortable lodging for as long as Dean needed to continue his search. The performance was flawless, honed by decades of practice, but Dean had spent his career studying liars and recognized every tell. Florence Sinclair bustled about preparing the guest quarters, her movements efficient and rehearsed. She asked careful questions about Dean's background, his travel plans, and most importantly, who knew about his current location. Her queries seemed like natural conversation, the kind of interest that isolated mountain folk might show toward visitors from the outside world. Dean answered truthfully about some things and lied strategically about others. He mentioned his connection to Sutherland, but didn't reveal his professional background. He described his planned route, but provided false information about his expected arrival at the next town. Most crucially, he implied that multiple people were tracking his progress, a detail that made the family exchange nearly imperceptible glances. From Dean's personal journal, December 5, 1879, the compound shows clear signs of organized activity beyond simple farming. Multiple outbuildings, sophisticated tool collections, and a family dynamic that suggests shared secrets rather than shared affection. The first evening proceeded exactly as Dean had expected. The Hollingsworths provided excellent hospitality, a hearty dinner of venison stew, warm bread, and conversation that revealed their deep knowledge of local geography and travel patterns. They seemed genuinely concerned about Sutherland's disappearance and offered detailed suggestions about where he might have gone. Their knowledge was too detailed. Irving described alternate routes with the precision of someone who'd guided many travelers through identical terrain. Florence mentioned specific hazards, washouts, wolf packs, and abandoned mines with the familiarity of someone who'd heard identical stories multiple times. Most telling, they knew exactly which paths would take someone away from populated areas and into regions where help would be impossible to find. Dean played his role perfectly, expressing gratitude for their guidance while carefully noting every detail of their compound's layout. He observed the placement of outbuildings, the location of tool sheds, and the curious fact that several structures showed recent construction despite the family's claims of financial hardship. During his tour of the property, Dean made a discovery that confirmed his worst suspicions. Behind the main house, partially concealed by carefully placed lumber, stood a structure that the Hollingsworths hadn't mentioned. A low building with no windows, heavy timber construction, and a chimney that showed recent use despite the lack of cooking smells. Maud noticed his interest and quickly explained that the building housed their smokehouse and root cellar, essential for preserving food through harsh mountain winters. Her explanation was reasonable, but Dean had investigated enough crime scenes to recognize the difference between food preservation and evidence disposal. The second day brought subtle changes in the family's behavior. Their warmth remained, but Dean detected increased surveillance. Someone always seemed to be watching him, ostensibly for hospitality purposes, but actually tracking his movements around the compound. Their questions became more probing, focusing on his travel schedule and the people expecting his return. Truth has weight that lies cannot match. Dean realized he was experiencing the same progression that had likely claimed Sutherland and countless others' initial hospitality designed to gather intelligence, followed by increased monitoring as the family assessed his threat level and planned their next steps. The only difference was that Dean understood exactly what was happening. His investigation had revealed evidence that the Hollingsworth compound served as more than a simple homestead. The family had developed infrastructure specifically designed for processing unwanted visitors, disposal systems that could eliminate evidence completely, and most disturbingly, organizational methods that suggested years of refinement and practice. Dean faced a deadly calculation. He possessed enough evidence to justify bringing law enforcement to the Hollow, but escape would require surviving long enough to reach civilization. The approaching storm had already made the roads impassable, trapping him in the compound with a family that had never allowed a suspicious visitor to leave alive. His professional training told him that the Hollingsworths were already planning his elimination, probably waiting for the storm to provide perfect cover for their actions. The question wasn't whether they intended to kill him. The question was whether 3 decades of success had made them overconfident when facing someone who understood their methods. What happens when hunters discover they're stalking prey that knows how to hunt back? The answer would determine whether Irving Dean became another name in their collection, or whether the Hollingsworth reign of terror finally met someone capable of exposing their secrets to the world. The floorboard beneath Dean's bed creaked once at 2:43 a.m. on December 7, 1879, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone testing the guest cabin's door latch from outside. Irving Dean lay motionless in the darkness, his hand wrapped around the derringer concealed beneath his pillow. Understanding that the Hollingsworths had finally decided he knew too much. Professional killers develop instincts about when their cover has been blown, and Dean's survival depended on whether his instincts were sharper than theirs. The whisper of wind through chinking between logs mingles with the distant clatter of metal against stone, while the acrid smell of coal oil from guttering lamps cannot mask the sweet stench of decomposition carried on night air, and rough wool blankets feel scratchy against skin that prickles with the certainty of being watched. Dean had spent the previous day conducting a careful reconnaissance of the compound, cataloging evidence that would damn the Hollingsworth family if he lived long enough to present it to authorities. His investigation had revealed the true scope of their operation. The smokehouse contained hooks designed for carcasses far larger than any game animal found in Kentucky mountains. The root cellar showed modifications that had nothing to do with food storage. Drain channels carved into stone floors, iron restraints mounted to walls, and wooden tables stained with substances that wouldn't wash clean. Most damning was his discovery of personal effects hidden throughout the compound. A leather satchel containing ministerial credentials buried beneath firewood, likely Granville Sutherland's final possessions. A woman's wedding ring wrapped in cloth and stored in a grain barrel. Children's shoes, far too many children's shoes, lined up beneath a workbench like trophies from forgotten victims. From Dean's Field Notes, December 6, 1879. Conservative estimate places victim count at minimum 30 individuals over past decade. Evidence suggests systematic operation with multiple family members participating in selection, elimination, and disposal processes. Irving Sinclair had grown increasingly suspicious as Dean's questions became more pointed. The detective had inquired about specific routes that Sutherland might have taken, routes that revealed intimate knowledge of local geography and travel patterns. More troubling, Dean had asked about other missing travelers, with a precision that suggested professional rather than personal interest. Florence Sinclair had attempted to drug Dean's evening meal with what appeared to be laudanum dissolved in whiskey. Dean had recognized the bitter undertaste and managed to dispose of most of the liquid while pretending to drink. The family's disappointment when he remained fully conscious had been carefully concealed but unmistakable to someone trained in reading criminal behavior. Maud Vanderbilt had made the most overt move, offering to show Dean her private collection of keepsakes from interesting visitors. Her cabin contained a display case filled with personal items that told the story of dozens of disappeared travelers' pocket watches, jewelry, eyeglasses, and most chilling, detailed sketches of their faces drawn with artistic skill that suggested intimate familiarity with their subjects. The family had realized they were dealing with someone who understood their methods and might possess the skills to expose them. Their hospitality had shifted from genuine warmth to calculated assessment, each family member taking turns to probe Dean's background and evaluate his threat level. Some games end in checkmate. Dean understood that his survival required maintaining the illusion of ignorance while gathering enough evidence to justify armed intervention. The Hollingsworths had to believe they still controlled the situation, while he prepared for the confrontation that was now inevitable. The sound outside his cabin had stopped, but Dean knew someone was still there. His years investigating violent criminals had taught him to recognize the particular stillness that preceded attack the moment when predators gathered themselves for the killing strike. He'd positioned himself strategically within the cabin, using furniture to create defensive positions and ensure clear sight lines to all possible entry points. His derringer contained only 2 shots, But Dean had also acquired a skinning knife from Irving's workshop and positioned several improvised weapons within easy reach. The Hollingsworths faced a dilemma that their 3 decades of success hadn't prepared them for. Their standard methods required victims who trusted them completely, but Dean had demonstrated awareness that made surprise impossible. They could attempt to overpower him through numbers, but violence carried risks they'd avoided through careful planning and isolated geography. Most importantly, Dean had implied that people were tracking his progress and would investigate if he failed to reach his next destination. The family couldn't be certain whether this was true, but 30 years of careful operation had taught them that unnecessary risks led to unwanted attention. Their solution revealed how thoroughly isolation had corrupted their judgment. Rather than allow Dean to leave and potentially expose them, the Hollingsworths had decided to test whether one man could survive against an entire family that had perfected the art of making people disappear. The door latch rattled again, followed by voices conferring in urgent whispers. Dean counted at least 3 distinct speakers: Irving, Florence, and what sounded like one of their adult children. They were coordinating an assault designed to overwhelm him before he could mount effective resistance. What they didn't realize was that Irving Dean had survived similar situations by understanding that defensive positions were temporary advantages real survival required, taking the fight to his attackers before they could execute their plan. But could one man, armed with determination and professional training, overcome a family that had spent 3 decades perfecting murder in their own territory? The answer would determine whether Dean's investigation ended with justice or simply added another name to the Hollingsworth collection of forgotten victims. Dean's Derringer fired twice through the cabin door at 4:06 a.m. on December 8, 1879, the muzzle flashes illuminating Irving Sinclair Hollingsworth's shocked face as he stumbled backward into the snow. The detective had abandoned any pretense of being a helpless victim. Survival meant becoming more dangerous than the predators hunting him. When civilization's rules no longer apply, victory belongs to whoever abandons morality first, while retaining the skills to use violence effectively. The sharp crack of gunshots echoes off limestone cliffs, while cordite smoke mingles with the metallic scent of fresh blood on pristine snow, and splintered wood feels rough against palms that shake, not from fear, but from the controlled fury of a man who has seen too much evil disguised as hospitality. Dean kicked open the damaged door and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness, his empty weapon now serving as a club, while his other hand gripped the skinning knife he'd appropriated from Irving's workshop. Irving Sinclair lay writhing in snow that was rapidly turning crimson, one bullet having shattered his shoulder while the second had torn through his thigh. He was wounded, but not dead, a mistake that Dean would need to correct before the man could alert the rest of his family to the detective's capabilities. Florence Sinclair emerged from behind the smokehouse, carrying a double-barreled shotgun with the familiarity of someone who'd used firearms to solve problems before. Her face showed none of the maternal warmth she'd displayed during Dean's visit, only the cold calculation of a predator whose territory had been invaded by something unexpectedly dangerous. Maud appeared from the opposite direction, moving with the silent efficiency that Dean had noticed during his reconnaissance. She carried what appeared to be a butcher's cleaver, its blade reflecting starlight in ways that suggested recent sharpening. Her approach was methodical, designed to flank Dean while Florence held his attention. The family had clearly rehearsed this scenario, probably practicing coordinated attacks against victims who might prove resistant to their standard methods. Their movements showed tactical awareness that Dean hadn't expected from mountain dwellers, suggesting that their 3 decades of murder had included encounters with travelers who possessed military or law enforcement experience. Death comes to those who hesitate. Dean had survived similar situations by understanding that numerical disadvantage required to eliminating threats sequentially, rather than attempting to fight multiple opponents simultaneously. Florence represented the immediate danger Her shotgun could end the confrontation regardless of Dean's close combat skills. He sprinted directly toward her, using Irving's prone body as partial cover while closing the distance too quickly for accurate shooting. Florence fired once, the blast tearing chunks of bark from a nearby tree, but missing Dean as he dove sideways and rolled behind the woodpile. Maud had anticipated his movement and positioned herself to cut off his retreat toward the main trail. Her cleaver whistled through the air as Dean rolled again, the blade embedding itself in firewood where his head had been seconds earlier. The detective came up swinging his derringer like a club, the heavy metal barrel connecting with Maud's temple and dropping her into the snow. Florence was reloading when Dean reached her, his skinning knife finding the gap between her ribs before she could bring the shotgun to bear. She collapsed without a sound, her blood steaming in the frigid air as her body settled into snow that would preserve the evidence of this night's violence until spring thaw. Irving had managed to drag himself behind the smokehouse, leaving a trail of blood that Dean followed with professional patience. The wounded man was trying to reach what appeared to be a signal bell mounted on the building's exterior wall, probably a method for alerting other family members who lived in the surrounding hollows. Dean found Irving attempting to tie a rope around the bell's clapper with hands that shook from blood loss and shock. The detective stood over him for a moment, studying the man who had spent decades perfecting the art of making people disappear, then used the skinning knife to ensure that Irving would never harm another traveler. The compound fell silent, except for wind through the trees and the distant sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Dean realized that the Hollingsworth family contained more members than he'd initially encountered. The gunshots had likely alerted relatives who lived in cabins scattered throughout the hollow. From Dean's field notes, December 8, 1879. Primary threats eliminated, but compound may house additional family members. Systematic search required to ensure no survivors remain, to continue operation or seek revenge against investigating authorities. Dean methodically searched the bodies, collecting weapons and any documents that might provide insight into the scope of their operation. Irving carried a leather wallet containing detailed notes about recent travelers, including physical descriptions, estimated wealth, and notations about which victims had been processed versus those who might still be held in the compound's underground facilities. The discovery that some victims might still be alive transformed Dean's mission from investigation to rescue operation. His examination of the compound's outbuildings had revealed several structures that appeared designed for imprisonment rather than storage: root cellars with reinforced doors, storm shelters with locks on the outside, and what appeared to be a spring house with bars across its windows. But dawn was approaching, and Dean could hear voices calling from the ridgelines above the hollow. The Hollingsworth clan was larger than he'd realized, and the survivors were coordinating a response to the violence that had disrupted 3 decades of successful operation. Could one man armed with determination and limited ammunition overcome an entire network of killers who knew every trail, every hiding place, and every escape route in their mountain territory? The answer would determine whether justice finally came to Deadman's Hollow, or whether the Hollingsworth name would claim one final victim before disappearing into the anonymity of Appalachian folklore. Dean's boots crunched through crystalline snow toward the reinforced spring house at 5:31 a.m. The sound of his approach masked by wind that carried voices from the ridgelines, voices coordinating in the mountain dialect that meant more Hollingsworths were coming. His systematic search of the compound had already revealed horrors that exceeded even his professional expectations. But the locked spring house promised answers about victims who might still draw breath. Understanding the full scope of the Hollingsworth operation required confronting evidence that challenged every assumption about the limits of human depravity. The scrape of iron against ice mingles with the distant baying of hunting dogs, while the fetid smell of human waste overpowers the clean scent of pine needles, and rusted metal bars feel bitter cold against fingers that tremble not from temperature, but from recognition of what such modifications implied. Dean had discovered that the compound contained multiple imprisonment facilities, each designed for different phases of the family's systematic approach to processing unwanted visitors. The spring house door required forcing with a pry bar Dean had retrieved from Irving's workshop. Inside, 3 human figures huddled in darkness so complete they seemed more shadow than flesh. 2 women and 1 man, their clothes reduced to filthy rags, their bodies showing the systematic malnutrition that comes from being kept alive for specific purposes. One of the women looked up when light penetrated their prison, her eyes reflecting terror so profound that Dean realized she'd been conditioned to expect only pain from human contact. She whispered through cracked lips, "Please, don't take Martha yet. She's too weak. Take me instead." The systematic horror revealed itself in fragments that Dean's mind struggled to process. The prisoners weren't random captives, they were breeding stock, kept alive to produce children who would never know any world beyond the Hollow's twisted customs. The Hollingsworth family had solved their succession problem by ensuring fresh generations raised from birth to consider their methods normal. Dean's examination of the other outbuildings revealed the full architecture of their operation. A nursery containing 6 children between ages 3 and 12, all bearing the distinctive Hollingsworth features, but clearly born to different mothers. A workshop where human bones were carved into tools and decorative items. Most chilling, a schoolhouse, where the family's educational philosophy was preserved in wooden tablets, covered with lessons about hunting, processing, and disposal techniques. From a child's slate found in the schoolhouse, dated October 1879, Uncle Irving says, "Strangers are gifts that walk to our door. We must be grateful for what Providence provides and waste nothing that can feed the family." The dogs were getting closer. Dean realized he faced a tactical situation that exceeded his individual capabilities. The compound housed more victims than he could escort to safety, more evidence than he could preserve, and faced threats from multiple directions as surviving family members converged on their ancestral territory. His professional training told him to prioritize intelligence gathering over rescue attempts, but the prisoner's condition made clear that delay meant death. He made the decision that would define his legacy in law enforcement. Rather than attempting to extract evidence and survivors through hostile territory, Dean would hold the compound until reinforcements arrived. His earlier messages to Kentucky authorities had included detailed location information and explicit instructions about what to expect. Help was coming, but survival until then required transforming from investigator into fortress defender. Dean's preparation revealed how thoroughly the Hollingsworths had militarized their operation. The compound contained enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army, suggesting that they'd anticipated eventual confrontation with law enforcement. More disturbing, their tactical preparations included predetermined firing positions, communication systems, and escape routes that indicated sophisticated planning. The family had clearly studied military tactics and applied them to their civilian operation. Their compound was designed as a defensive position capable of withstanding siege conditions, with multiple water sources, extensive food storage, and underground tunnels connecting various structures. They'd planned for the possibility that their crimes might eventually attract organized opposition. Dean's discovery of their tactical preparations explained how the Hollingsworths had operated successfully for 3 decades without detection. They hadn't simply relied on isolation. They'd created a fortress capable of protecting their secrets through force when necessary. Previous investigations had probably ended with the investigator's disappearance rather than exposure of family activities. The voices from the ridgelines had grown closer, and Dean could now distinguish individual speakers coordinating their approach to the compound. He counted at least 8 distinct voices, suggesting that the Hollingsworth clan included relatives who lived throughout the surrounding mountains and could respond quickly to threats against the main operation. Their coordination revealed something more troubling than individual family violence. It suggested a network of related families who shared the Hollingsworth's methods and benefited from their success. The compound might represent only the central node of a larger operation that included multiple sites throughout Kentucky's unmapped territories. Could one man defend a position against attackers who knew every approach route and had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this scenario? The answer would determine whether the Hollingsworth compound became a monument to justice or simply another location where law enforcement officers disappeared without explanation, their investigations buried along with their bones. Muzzle flashes erupted from the tree line at 6:49 a.m. on December 8, 1879, as 8 members of the extended Hollingsworth clan opened coordinated fire on their own compound, their bullets splintering the very walls that had sheltered 3 decades of systematic murder. Dean crouched behind an overturned table in the main house, returning fire with weapons he'd collected from the family's own arsenal, understanding that survival meant using their fortress against them. The difference between justice and massacre often depends on who controls the high ground when the shooting starts. The whistle of rifle bullets through morning air mingles with the sharp crack of splintering timber, while gunpowder smoke burns the nostrils and masks the scent of fierce sweat, and rough-hewn floorboards feel solid against a detective's shoulder as he calculates angles of fire that will keep killers from reclaiming their ancestral hunting ground. Dean had spent the previous hour transforming the compound's defensive features to his advantage, barricading doors, positioning ammunition, and creating firing positions that maximized his tactical options while limiting his attacker's mobility. The assault revealed the true extent of the Hollingsworth network. Dean counted at least 3 distinct family units coordinating their attack, not just relatives, but organized cells that had clearly practiced military-style operations. Their movements showed tactical sophistication that exceeded anything he'd expected from mountain dwellers, suggesting that their isolation had bred not just moral corruption, but genuine military capability. Phineas Webb Hollingsworth, Irving's eldest brother, commanded the assault from a position overlooking the compound's main approach. His voice carried clearly through the morning air as he coordinated flanking movements designed to overwhelm Dean's defensive positions. The family had clearly studied siege warfare and understood how to apply those principles to their ancestral territory. Dean's discovery of the compound's hidden features provided crucial advantages. The Hollingsworths had built their fortress with multiple escape routes, underground passages, and concealed firing positions, features Dean could exploit against their original creators. His exploration had revealed that the main house connected to the smokehouse through a tunnel system designed for moving prisoners without outside observation. From Dean's tactical assessment, December 8, 1879, enemy demonstrates coordinated small unit tactics consistent with military training. Compound's defensive features suggest long-term preparation for exactly this type of confrontation. Victory requires holding position until reinforcements arrive. The family's attack strategy revealed their fundamental weakness. They'd grown overconfident through 3 decades of success against helpless victims. Their assault assumed Dean would behave like their usual prey, cowering in fear rather than mounting organized resistance. They hadn't prepared for an opponent who understood their methods and possessed the skills to turn their own weapons against them. Dean used the compound's underground passages to maneuver between firing positions, creating the illusion of multiple defenders while conserving ammunition for tactical advantage. His movement through the tunnel system revealed additional horrors. Storage chambers filled with personal effects from hundreds of victims, workshops where human remains had been processed for various purposes, and most disturbing, detailed records documenting 3 decades of systematic murder. The siege had awakened the compound's prisoners, who huddle in their various confinements, listening to gunfire that might represent either rescue or simply a change of ownership. Dean realized that his tactical situation included protecting non-combatants who couldn't defend themselves, but whose survival would provide crucial testimony about the Hollingsworth operation. Blood feeds the Hollow's hunger. The family's coordination began breaking down as Dean's defensive tactics exceeded their expectations. Phineas had planned for a quick assault that would overwhelm one man through superior numbers, but Dean's use of their own defensive positions created casualties that forced them to reconsider their approach. Two of the attackers had already fallen to precise shooting from concealed positions. Lenora Hollingsworth, Phineas's daughter, and a skilled marksman in her own right, attempted to infiltrate the compound through the root cellar entrance. Her approach revealed intimate knowledge of the compound's layout, but Dean had anticipated exactly this strategy and prepared accordingly. The underground passages that the family considered their secret advantage became death traps when defended by someone who understood their configuration. The sound of approaching horses from the main trail announced the arrival of Kentucky State Police, responding to Dean's earlier messages with a force that included 12 armed officers and a federal marshal. The timing was providential. Dean's ammunition was running low, and the family's tactical coordination suggested they were preparing for a final assault designed to overwhelm his position through concentrated firepower. Phineas Webb recognized the sound of organized law enforcement and made the decision that would seal his family's fate. Rather than surrender or attempt escape, he ordered a final assault on the compound designed to eliminate all witnesses before the authorities could secure evidence of their crimes. The family chose to fight rather than face justice, transforming their ancestral territory into a battlefield where survival would determine whether decades of murder finally faced legal consequences. The approaching authorities represented more than rescue. They carried the power to expose the full scope of the Hollingsworth operation and ensure that justice finally reached a family that had considered themselves beyond law's reach. But could 12 law enforcement officers overcome an entire clan of killers fighting on their home territory, especially when that territory had been designed specifically for repelling exactly this type of intervention? The answer would determine whether Deadman's Hollow became a symbol of justice triumphant or simply another location where law enforcement learned that some evils run too deep for civilization to uproot. The federal marshal's Winchester rifle cracked once at 7:22 a.m., sending Phineas Webb Hollingsworth spinning into the snow with a bullet through his chest, ending 3 decades of systematic murder with the kind of frontier justice that mountain folk understood better than courtroom proceedings. The arrival of 12 armed lawmen had transformed a desperate siege into a methodical execution of criminals who'd finally encountered opponents equipped with both legal authority and superior firepower. When civilization finally reaches the darkest corners of human depravity, justice often arrives, measured in grains of gunpowder rather than paragraphs of legal precedent. The thunder of coordinated rifle fire echoes through limestone canyons, while acrid smoke mingles with the iron scent of blood on pristine snow, and frozen ground feels solid beneath boots that carry the weight of federal authority into a valley that had never acknowledged any law beyond family tradition. Federal Marshal Lucius Carrington had responded to Dean's intelligence with a force specifically assembled to confront organized criminal activity, men who understood that some situations required overwhelming force rather than negotiated surrender. The Hollingsworth clan's final stand revealed both their tactical sophistication and their fundamental limitation. They'd spent 3 decades perfecting murder techniques against helpless victims, but their experience didn't translate to combat against trained law enforcement officers who understood military tactics and possessed superior equipment. The family's confidence had been built on controlling every variable, but federal intervention had introduced factors beyond their preparation. Lenora Hollingsworth attempted to escape through the underground tunnel system, only to encounter Dean waiting in the passages she'd considered her family's secret advantage. Her death eliminated the last member of the clan's operational leadership, leaving only scattered relatives who lacked coordination to mount effective resistance against federal forces. Marshal Carrington's systematic approach to clearing the compound revealed the full scope of evidence that would document the Hollingsworth crimes for legal proceedings. His officers discovered detailed records spanning 3 decades, personal effects from hundreds of victims, and most importantly, living witnesses whose testimony would ensure that the family's methods became part of official legal record rather than mountain folklore. From Marshal Carrington's official report, filed January 3, 1880, investigation confirms systematic operation involving multiple family units engaged in robbery, kidnapping, and murder of travelers throughout eastern Kentucky. Conservative estimate places victim count at minimum 150 individuals over a 30-year period. The compound's prisoners required immediate medical attention and careful handling to preserve their value as witnesses. Their testimony would provide crucial evidence about the family's methods, but their psychological condition reflected the systematic trauma inflicted by captors who'd treated human beings as livestock for processing. Several children had never seen the outside world, having been born and raised within the hollow's isolated environment. Dean's investigation had uncovered evidence that the Hollingsworth operation extended beyond simple murder for profit. The family had developed customs that treated human consumption as sacramental activity, believing that consuming their victims transferred strength and spiritual power to clan members. Their crimes combined practical robbery with ritualistic practices that elevated murder to religious significance, justice carved in bone and blood. The federal sweep had also revealed connections between the Hollingsworth clan and similar operations throughout Appalachian territory. Marshal Carrington's interviews with surviving family members exposed a network of related clans who shared methods, traded victims, and coordinated activities across multiple states. The Hollow represented only one node in a larger criminal organization that had operated beyond law enforcement reach for decades. The tactical resolution of the siege required only 3 hours, but documenting the evidence would consume months of investigation. Federal authorities discovered that the Hollingsworth compound contained enough documentation to support prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, potentially exposing criminal networks that had operated throughout America's frontier territories. Dean's survival and the preservation of crucial evidence meant that the Hollingsworth crimes would face legal accountability rather than disappearing into mountain folklore. The federal investigation would establish legal precedents for prosecuting organized criminal activity in isolated territories where traditional law enforcement had limited reach. The cleanup revealed additional horrors that exceeded even Dean's professional expectations. Underground chambers contained evidence of victims who'd been kept alive for extended periods, workshops where human remains had been processed for various purposes, and documentation suggesting that the family had sold processed human flesh to unsuspecting customers throughout Kentucky's remote communities. The Hollingsworth name would enter legal history as America's most documented case of systematic cannibalism, but the investigation also raised disturbing questions about how many similar operations might exist in territories where federal authority remained theoretical rather than practical. The Hollow's isolation had enabled decades of unchecked criminal activity, but similar geographic conditions existed throughout America's frontier regions. Could civilization ever truly reach every corner of a continent where isolation bred customs that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature? The federal investigation would expose criminal networks that operated beyond traditional law enforcement reach, but it would also reveal how many dark hollows remained unmapped by authorities who assumed that law extended wherever American flags were planted. Even today, locals in eastern Kentucky claim that winter winds through Deadman's Hollow still carry the sound of Maud Hollingsworth humming lullabies while she sharpens her knives, waiting for travelers who trust mountain hospitality more than their own survival instincts.